Bread is a staple part of UK cupboards and a key part of diets all around the world. Cheap, filling and easily transportable, it's not hard to see how it's become such an essential. But in the UK, bread is also our most wasted food item. It's estimated that around the world, 60% of us eat bread every single day. But in the UK, we throw away 680,000 tonnes of the stuff every year, mostly from loaves that we start and don't finish. This isn't a problem just because of food waste. Wheat is one of the big monocultures that dominates land all across the world. In 2019, it had more land than any other food crop, with 538 million acres dedicated to it. Growing a crop like wheat so intensively reduces biodiversity, increases the use of really damaging pesticides and fertilizers, and makes us much more reliant on a fairly low nutritional staple. So, to find out how bread became such a big part of our diets and how we can lessen the environmental impact of our favourite wheat product, we're going back in time to see how the way that we've made bread has changed over the centuries. So the story goes that back in ancient Egyptian times, a key part of people's diets was grains and water, basically like a porridge. And one day somebody left their bowl out in the sun. Yeast found its way into it and it started bubbling, and then somebody had the idea to heat it up and bread was made. This idea spread around really quickly and loads of different cultures came up with their own ways of making bread. In dietary terms, it was a game changer. It was tasty, it was easy to transport, and it made the nutrients from wheat way easier to digest. So before the 18th century, a wheat field would look really different to how it looks today. There would have been loads of different varieties of wheat growing next to each other, bringing a diversity to the crop which modern breeding has removed. Today, we breed wheat really carefully to make sure that we get a consistent harvest. But the kind of wheat that's most commonly grown all around the world requires a huge amount of chemical fertilizers in order to grow efficiently. Industrial wheat farms are also way less likely to rotate their crops. Because wheat is an annual crop, it takes a lot of nutrients out of the soil. A traditional wheat farmer would have done something called rotating, which basically just means planting something else in the field every other year, like peas, to put nutrients back into the soil. The kinds of bread our ancestors were eating would also look really different to the white loaves that you see in supermarkets today. It wasn't until the invention of the steel roller mill in the 19th century that you could separate the different parts of the grain to make the truly white flour that most of us eat today. Flour made this way could be produced on a much larger scale and it had a longer shelf life, so it was cheaper to produce and to transport. There was just one hitch, that white flour with the bran and the germ removed is essentially nutritionally void, and people started getting really sick because bread was such a big part of their diets. Rather than going back to more traditional methods, companies just decided to fortify this bread with vitamins and sell it as a brand new, shiny, modern product, even better than the bread that contained these nutrients naturally. Then, fast forward to 1961, a mill in the UK invented a brand new way to make bread, the Charley Wood way. This has now been exported to countries all around the world, and today 80% of the bread that you see on supermarket shelves is still made using the Charley Wood method, even the ones that say brown or seeded. The research bakers at Charley Wood found out if you added hard fats, extra yeast and a couple of extra chemicals and then mixed it at a really high speed, you could get a dough that was ready to bake in a fraction of the time. It made a really soft, springy white bread that was an instant hit with the public and continues to be so today. And the reason this is important to bread waste is that in the UK, we're really used to buying cheap bread that arguably isn't as nutritious or as tasty as it could be. And because it's a staple, we tend to buy way more than we need so that we don't open the kitchen cupboards in the morning and find we've run out. All of this means that we're way more likely to let a loaf go stale and then have to throw it out. I'm interested in finding out a little bit more about what the future of wheat farming might look like and how we can all buy a more sustainable loaf. So I'm going to speak to David Wolfe. He's one of the runners of Wakelyn's farm, which is an amazing place in Sussex that's been trying out new ways of growing wheat.
So my name is David Wolfe. My parents set up Wakelyn's from 1994, and my brother and I and our families have now taken over running Wakelyn's and taking it into a new phase. Wakelyn's is organic, but it's also agroforestry. So there's two components. The organic, I think you probably well understand. The agroforestry needs a bit more explanation. So agroforestry is essentially crops grown in between trees. There are different ways of doing that. In some places like Spain, they have olive trees in wheat fields, and at Wakelyn's is done with lines of trees with alleys of crops in between. So we have 56 lines of trees running north-south, which separate cropping alleys, and the cropping alleys, our narrowest are 12 metres wide and our widest are 18 metres wide. So in those alleys, we then have an organic rotation, which includes wheat, lentils, squash, and obviously lay periods in the cycle. And then in the tree alleys, we have a variety of different trees, some of which are timber trees or biomass trees, many of which are grown for food, so fruit, nuts, and so on. And one of the things that makes Wakelyn's particularly special is not only is it 25 years old, but also the sheer diversity of the trees in the tree lines. So you will see other places where they have agroforestry, typically younger, but very often that will be rows of apple trees or something like that. So essentially, very often almost two monocultures. What people say about Wakelyn's is it's the oldest and probably the most diverse agroforestry system. And it's the diversity that I think my father in particular would have celebrated.
What does the future of this kind of farming look like? Because I imagine at the moment you're producing on a relatively small scale in compared to some of the larger wheat farms which are producing bread on an industrial scale.
So Wakelyn's is, in the scheme of British farming, very much at the smallest end because it was conceived as a sort of innovation demonstration site. But I don't think there's anything we're doing here that couldn't be done on a larger scale. It's just a question of adapting your techniques and taking the plunge.
Taking the plunge, I like that. And how can we, as purchasers of bread and goods and supermarket shoppers, support?
So one of the things that we're very interested in is what they call short food chains. There's not a lot of steps in between the farming and the food produced. So it's really looking out for the labelling, but also making direct connections with producers and encouraging the short food chains. In terms of encouraging people, well, there are political reasons to do what we're doing around climate change and so on. There's a guy called George Young, farming in Essex, who says he's setting up a lot of agroforestry because he wants to be a good ancestor. And I think that's quite a nice way of putting it. As I say, farming depends upon public inputs, and those public inputs need to be tailored to support the right kind of farming. And we think agroforestry is a key component of that.
Now, making bread this way isn't going to work on an industrial scale. And while there's some problems to mass production, there's no doubt that it means that we can all buy bread affordably. The biggest problem is when we see bread as so cheap that we can just throw it away, especially when there are loads of amazing ways to preserve it. Luckily, there's loads of things that you can do if you want to look after your loaf. So if you can, make a loaf of bread for yourself, even if you only do it once. I promise you'll have way more respect for bread once you've had to knead the dough yourself. Put bread in the freezer. I think people are worried that it will reduce the quality of bread, but if you're sticking it in the toaster anyway, it really doesn't matter, and you'll always have fresh bread when you need it. Don't buy more than you need. I know it's tempting to pick up a second loaf, but chances are this will probably go off in the cupboard before you need it anyway. Try some recipes to use up the ends. In my house, there's always like a bag of bread with just 2 ends left over, but rather than throwing these away, use them in bread salads or with stews. Thank you for coming with me on our whistle-stop tour through the history of bread. If you want to know what to do with your stale bread, then go and check out a recipe that I made with Hubbub chef Mark a couple of years ago. It's a panzanella, it's amazing, go and try it. And leave me your favourite bread recipes in the comments.